December 7, 1941. The sky above Pearl Harbor turns black. Fire and oil mix on the water's surface, battleships burn, and sailors dive into flames to survive. Within hours, America, unshocked, grieving, furious, is at war. But as the military scrambles to respond, another problem emerges. One not of bullets or bombs, but of roofs and walls. Where would they house the millions of men now being drafted? Where would they store supplies, treat the wounded, feed soldiers, or build command posts in faraway jungles and deserts? The U.S. Army and Navy faced a logistical nightmare. They didn't just need weapons. They needed shelter, simple, strong, fast. Inside a cramped office in Washington, D.C., days after the Pearl Harbor attack, Commander Robert Heller of the U.S. Navy Bureau of Yards and Docks slams a report onto a table. "We need a building," he says to the group of engineers gathered before him, "that can be built by anyone, anywhere, in any weather." The room falls silent. An older officer laughs nervously. "Sir, you're asking for a miracle." Heller lights a cigarette. "Then let's build one." The Navy sends out a design request, marked urgent. It lands in Rhode Island, at a small engineering station near Narragansett Bay, in a place called Quonset Point. That name, quiet, strange, almost musical, will soon echo around the world. Two engineers take the challenge, George Fuller and Otto Brandenburg. Their orders are clear. Design a building that can be mass-produced, packed flat into crates, shipped across oceans, and assembled by men with no training. It must survive heat, cold, storms, and war. It must be home and fortress both. Inside a drafty warehouse, the men start sketching. They study an older British design, the Quonset Hut, a semicircular shelter made of corrugated steel from World War I. It worked well for the British, but it was narrow, hard to build, and inefficient to ship. The Americans needed something wider, simpler, faster. The engineers worked day and night. The sound of typewriters, saws, and hammers echoes through the Rhode Island night. Winter winds lash against the bay, and inside, under harsh light bulbs, a new shape begins to form, a perfect half-cylinder, wide and graceful like the shell of a great iron whale. By January 1942, the prototype stands ready, 20 feet wide, 48 feet long, curved ribs of light steel bolted to wooden foundations, covered with sheets of galvanized metal. The ends are plywood, the interior lined with insulation. It's ugly, brutally simple, but it works. It's strong, portable, and fast. When the first structure stands complete, George Fuller walks around it slowly, running his hand along the cold steel. "She's not beautiful," he says quietly, "but she'll win the war." The men laugh, but they all know this is something new. The Navy approves it almost immediately. The building is named after the place it was born, the Quonset Hut. Production begins before the ink is dry. The George A. Fuller Company is contracted to lead manufacturing, and within days, new factories open in Rhode Island and New Jersey. Machines thunder day and night. Sheets of corrugated metal roll out like waves of silver. Men rivet, weld, and stack components while women pack boxes with bolts, screws, and blueprints. Each hut can be broken down into thousands of parts, around 16 tons of material, and loaded into crates small enough to fit on trucks, trains, or ships. The label reads, U.S. Navy Prefabricated Unit. A small instruction booklet is included with every shipment. How to build a Quonset Hut. It's just 11 pages long. No fancy language, just pictures and short notes like, Step 4, align ribs. Step 5, tighten bolts evenly. 8 men can build one hut in less than a day, using nothing but wrenches and determination. By February 1942, the first Quonset huts are shipped out. They sail across the Pacific and Atlantic, bound for the ends of the earth. Some arrive in Panama, where Marines build them under a sweltering sun. Others go to Iceland, where sailors assemble them in freezing wind. The same parts, the same steel ribs, the same American hands. On tropical islands, the curved roofs reflect the sun. In frozen tundras, they shed snow like Arctic beasts. The huts prove unstoppable. A field commander writes in a report, "They rise like mushrooms after rain. Ugly as hell, but tougher than anything we've seen." Soon the huts are everywhere. On beaches, airstrips, mountain bases, and jungle clearings, they serve as hospitals, barracks, kitchens, offices, churches, and storage depots. Soldiers begin to love them. The curved roof, the hum of rain against the steel. It feels somehow like safety. A Marine in the Solomon Islands writes to his mother, "We sleep in Quonsets now. Tin roofs and all. They leak in the rain but keep out the rats. Funny thing is, Ma, feels like home." By late 1942, demand explodes. The Navy orders 16,000 more huts, then 20,000, then 50,000. The numbers become impossible to track. Every corner of the United States joins the effort. In California, a shipyard builds Quonset components between shifts. In Detroit, automobile factories turn from cars to steel ribs. In Pittsburgh, workers roll out endless sheets of galvanized metal. Even high school students volunteer on weekends, helping pack crates marked for the Pacific. The war has become a machine, and the Quonset hut is one of its gears. The design evolves quickly. The original model, 16 feet wide, is joined by a jumbo 40-foot version. The engineers modify the blueprints based on letters from the front. Soldiers in the Pacific complain of heat, so vents and windows are added. Arctic troops request better insulation, so layers of fiberboard and tar paper are included. Every change is tested, drawn, approved, and shipped again. The design becomes a living, breathing creation. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, Marines build Quonsets beside muddy airstrips. In the Aleutian Islands, soldiers anchor them against hurricane winds. In the deserts of North Africa, they are covered with sandbags to protect from bombs. Each hut adapts to its world. The curved walls deflect wind, resist explosions, and shed snow. Inside, men hang clothes, radios, and photographs on the steel ribs. The huts become more than structures. They are shelters for memory. By 1943, Quonset huts are as common as tents. Over 120,000 have been shipped across the world. Doctors perform surgery inside them. Pilots receive mission briefings under their arches. Commanders plan invasions in them. Priests say prayers inside their echoing walls. In one hut on a small Pacific island, a wounded pilot is carried in on a stretcher. A nurse wipes his forehead as rain drums softly on the roof. The war outside rages, but inside the sound feels almost peaceful. Every hut holds a story like that. Back home, the factories never stop. The night shifts blur into day. Workers paint slogans on the walls. Build fast, they need it now. Posters hang near the exits showing Marines smiling beneath curved steel roofs. "Your work keeps them safe," the caption reads. By 1944, the US military can assemble an entire base, offices, dorms, warehouses, kitchens, using nothing but Quonset huts. Entire villages rise from crates in days. The design becomes a symbol of American efficiency. When D-Day approaches, thousands of huts are packed onto ships bound for Europe, each labeled for the invasion. Normandy, Cherbourg, Antwerp. The first huts to arrive in France become command posts for the Allied push inland. Soldiers call them half-moons, tin cans, and sometimes lucky charms. Through mud, snow, and gunfire, they stand. In England, Quonsets serve as aircraft hangars and radar posts. In Italy, as hospitals and mess halls. In the Pacific, as repair shops and sleeping quarters. They are everywhere, in every photograph, behind every soldier. By late 1944, over 150,000 huts exist worldwide, each one stamped Quonset Point RI on its side. From the Arctic to the equator, from coral beaches to mountain ridges, the curved steel huts reflect the light of every corner of the war, and yet few of the men who live in them know where they came from. Few ever imagine that one day after the war, these same huts will house families, schools, and shops, that they will outlast the war itself. As 1944 draws to an end, the world begins to change. Victory seems near, but no one knows how long the fighting will last. Factories continue to roar, crates continue to ship, the steel continues to bend, to rise, to protect. And somewhere in Rhode Island, under grey skies, George Fuller stands outside the original Quonset workshop. He looks at the bay, then at the factory gates. Dozens of trucks roll out, carrying more huts to the docks. He smiles faintly and says to a young worker beside him, "They'll never know our names, but they'll live inside our work." The young man nods. "Sir, you think these things will last after the war?" Fuller pauses, then says, "Maybe. Things built with purpose often do." He's right. The Quonset hut's purpose will soon outlive the war it was built for. But for now, as 1945 approaches and the world trembles between hope and exhaustion, the huts stand as silent guardians of an army stretched. Across the planet, the curved steel shells holding the heartbeat of history and the story of what happens next, of how these wartime shelters transform into homes, schools, and monuments of survival is only beginning. The war was ending. The guns were growing silent, one battlefield at a time. In Europe, the spring of 1945 carried the smell of smoke and flowers together, the strange scent of peace after years of chaos. Across bombed cities, soldiers stood in streets too quiet to believe. The world had survived, barely. But in the aftermath of victory came a new challenge, a problem as vast as the war itself. Millions of soldiers needed to come home. Millions more civilians were displaced, homeless or scattered across ruined continents. Cities were destroyed, towns burned to ashes, villages erased, and spread across the globe, standing silent beneath strange skies, were more than 150,000 Quonset huts built for war, now without a war to serve. In France, in Italy, in the Philippines, on Pacific atolls, everywhere American forces had gone, the curved steel huts remained. They had weathered bombs, storms, and time itself. The military called them temporary structures, but they had proven anything but temporary. Now, as peace settled over the world, these huts became the skeletons of a new beginning. In 1945, when the U.S. Navy began the slow process of withdrawing troops, thousands of Quonset huts were left behind. Some were sold to local governments. Others were given to schools, hospitals, and relief agencies. The U.S. military had no real plan for what to do with them. They simply existed, sturdy and silent, waiting for new purpose, and purpose found them. In war-torn Britain, where German bombs had flattened whole neighborhoods, people needed homes. Thousands of British families moved into abandoned American Quonset huts. The curved steel roofs echoed the laughter of children once again. Mothers painted the inside walls, turned supply crates into tables, and hung curtains where bullet holes had once been. For the first time in years, people slept without fear of air raids. In Italy and France, they became schools. In the Philippines, clinics. In Japan, shelters for families left homeless by the war. In the South Pacific, the huts stood as outposts of civilization amid chaos. Some turned into churches, others into markets. The United States itself had its own crisis. Millions of soldiers were coming home to a housing shortage. Cities were overcrowded, factories were shifting from war to peace, and new families were being formed faster than homes could be built. It was the start of what journalists would call the baby boom, but no one had houses for the boom to live in. And so, the Quonset hut, the ugly, simple steel half-moon of war, was called upon once again. In 1946, the U.S. government began selling surplus huts to the public. For just a few $100s, a man could buy an entire house shipped flat-packed on a truck or train. Magazines ran advertisements, showing smiling couples standing beside gleaming metal huts. "Build your own home in a day," the slogans promised. Thousands did. From California to New York, veterans bought Quonset huts and built them on empty lots, farms, and suburbs. They installed wooden floors, painted walls, added porches and chimneys. The curved ceilings made the rooms feel larger than they were. The sound of rain on steel became the lullaby of a new generation. In some small towns, entire neighborhoods of Quonset huts appeared. People called them victory villages. Children played ball in the streets between the silver domes, while mothers hung laundry on lines strung from hut to hut. At night, the soft light of kerosene lamps glowed through the curved windows. For many veterans, living in a Quonset hut felt strangely comforting. It reminded them of the war, but in a peaceful way. It was like bringing a piece of their survival home with them. But not everyone loved them. Architects called them ugly, temporary, and crude. Real estate agents said they'd never last. City planners called them eyesores. Yet the people who lived inside them didn't care. For families who had nothing, a Quonset hut wasn't ugly. It was hope with a roof. Colleges soon saw the same potential. When soldiers returned home and flooded universities under the new GI Bill, campuses ran out of classrooms overnight. To fix the crisis, universities across America ordered thousands of surplus Quonset huts from the military. At Harvard, Stanford, and the University of Michigan, the curved metal huts popped up across the lawns like silver seeds. They served as dormitories, lecture halls, and even laboratories. Professors taught physics under steel arches once meant for war. Students joked that they were studying in tin cans, but they loved them. Warm in winter, cool in summer, and cheap to heat. Even Hollywood noticed. In the late 1940s, Quonset huts appeared in movies as symbols of rebuilding, of resilience, of the new American spirit that refused to waste anything. Even the relics of war. Back in Rhode Island, the original factory at Quonset Point slowed, but never stopped. Workers who had once built huts for the Pacific now built them for peace. The Fuller Company created civilian models: Quonset homes, Quonset barns, Quonset churches. The idea was the same: fast, strong, and simple. But the huts also began to spread in unexpected ways. In Alaska, they became weather stations and post offices. In Hawaii, surf shops and cafes. In Africa and South America, U.S. aid programs used Quonset huts as hospitals and schools. The curved steel that once sheltered soldiers now sheltered children learning their first alphabet. By 1948, more than 500,000 Quonset huts had been built. Some stood on military bases, still active. Others had vanished into civilian life. A new model called the Butler Building emerged, a commercial cousin of the original, used for warehouses and factories. The design had evolved again, proving the same principle over and over. Simplicity endures, but the Quonset hut was more than metal. It had become a symbol. It represented the power of practicality, of taking something built for destruction and turning it into creation. Every hut that became a home told a story, of war turned to peace, of necessity turned to invention, of survival turned to life, yet even symbols fade with time. By the early 1950s, America had begun to dream bigger: brick homes, picket fences, shiny cars, and television sets. The humble Quonset hut, curved and metallic, looked out of place in the glossy magazines of the new suburban age. Developers demolished many of them to make way for larger homes and office buildings. Still, not all were lost. Across the countryside, farmers discovered that Quonset huts made perfect barns. Their curved shape resisted wind. Their open interiors stored hay and tractors with ease. In small towns, they became workshops, garages, and even small-town churches. One preacher in Kansas bought an old military hut, painted it white, and placed a cross on top. "Steel or stone," he told his congregation, "it's what's inside that makes it sacred." And far from the cities, in the quiet corners of the world, the huts simply refused to die. In 1952, a hurricane struck the Marshall Islands, flattening most buildings on one atoll. But the old Quonset huts from the war still stood. In Korea, during another conflict, the U.S. military used them again. The same design, the same manual, barely changed. It was as if the Quonset refused to stay in the past. By then, its legend was written into history. Newspapers called it the building that followed the flag. Engineers studied it in universities as a marvel of wartime design. Even NASA, in its early years, used modified Quonset huts as test labs and storage units. Decade by decade, they aged. Their steel faded from silver to brown. Their wooden floors creaked. Their doors rusted. But still they stood. Somewhere in the Midwest, an old veteran in 1957 sits on his porch, a porch he built onto his Quonset hut home. The curved roof glows gold in the evening sun. He smokes quietly and says to his neighbor, "I lived in one of these in '43, back on Tarawa. Funny thing, it hasn't changed a bit." His neighbor nods. Guess they made them right the first time. And they had. Even as the 1960s arrived and new materials and plastics, concrete, fiberglass, began to dominate architecture. The old Quonset huts continued to serve. They weren't fashionable. They weren't glamorous. But they were still here. Every curve, every bolt, every rib of steel told a story of human ingenuity, born out of desperation. They were built for war, but became monuments to peace. By the end of the 1960s, the U.S. government officially retired the Quonset hut design from new military use. But they never really disappeared. On college campuses, in small towns, on old airfields and forgotten islands, they continued to live quiet lives. Homes, warehouses, workshops, temples, shelters. Their legacy spread far beyond architecture. They had changed the way people thought about construction itself, about speed, modularity, and simplicity. The age of prefabrication had begun with a war, and the Quonset hut had led the charge. As the world moved on, most people forgot where they came from, but some didn't. At Quonset Point, Rhode Island, where it all began, one of the original huts still stood in the late 1970s. Rusted, patched, and worn, It was used as a small museum by retired Navy engineers. Inside, under the curved roof that had once sheltered the blueprints of a nation at war, a single sign hung on the wall. By early 1943, the rhythmic pounding of hammers echoed across dozens of military bases and ports. The Quonset Hut had become more than a structure. It was a symbol. From the red dust of North Africa to the humid jungles of the Pacific, its curved silhouette was instantly recognizable. Soldiers called it the Tin Turtle, the Nissan's cousin, or simply home. In the Tunisian desert, the U.S. Army's 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, used Quonset huts as field hospitals. When the sandstorms howled and visibility dropped to zero, medics worked under the curved tin roofs lit only by lanterns. The walls rattled, dust seeped through every crack, and yet the structure held. Underneath those arched ribs, lives were saved every single night. A young nurse named Eleanor Finch wrote home describing the scene. "We have 50 cots inside, and the wounded come in waves. The heat is unbearable, but this little hut keeps the wind out. When the shells fall, the sound runs over the roof like rain. Sometimes I think this curved roof has more courage than any of us." Meanwhile, across the ocean in Pearl Harbor's naval yard, the U.S. Navy had turned Quonset huts into offices, radio posts, and mess halls. The design's modular system, bolted ribs and prefabricated panels, meant that even sailors with no construction experience could erect one in less than a day. The huts became command centers during the island-hopping campaign, controlling movements of fleets and air squadrons from under those corrugated roofs. The Navy Seabees, construction battalions known for their grit and humor, became masters of the Quonset. With sweat-soaked shirts and cigarettes dangling from their lips, they raised them in mud, snow, or jungle. In the Solomon Islands, Seabee foreman Jack Red Brennan once claimed, "You can build a Quonset on a pile of coconuts if you've got enough bolts." He wasn't exaggerating. On Guadalcanal, engineers literally used palm logs for foundations when the soil turned to swamp. What made the Quonset so special wasn't just its shape, it was its soul. Every curve, every rivet was designed with a single goal: utility under chaos. The hut could house soldiers, serve as a workshop, or store ammunition. The U.S. Army built versions with kitchens, chapels, and even theaters. In England, near the airfields of East Anglia, American bomber crews slept in Quonset huts while waiting for missions over occupied Europe. The sound of B-17s roaring into the dawn was often the morning alarm. Inside those huts, young men wrote letters, played cards, and dreamed of home. The curved roof became a screen for projected films on Sunday nights. In one base, a chaplain painted the inside white and hung a wooden cross, turning a Quonset into a church. When men knelt on the steel floor to pray, their whispered voices blended with the soft tapping of rain against metal. But the Quonset's greatest test came not in Europe, but in the Pacific. There, nature itself declared war. Torrential rain, hurricanes, and tropical heat pushed every design to its breaking point. Yet the hut endured. On the island of Tarawa, engineers arrived after the bloody battle to find no standing buildings, but a handful of bent Quonset frames still upright amid the wreckage. Within days, they rebuilt an entire command post using salvaged pieces. The military's need for speed meant production skyrocketed. By mid-1943, the Quonset hut was being churned out at a rate of nearly 500 per day. Factory workers, many of them women, packed each kit into crates labeled QH-16 or QH-20. The components were shipped by rail, truck, and cargo ship to nearly every theater of war. Some were even parachuted in pieces to remote airstrips. The variety expanded too. There was the Quonset Redesign 100, slightly wider for medical units, the Quonset 40 used for living quarters, and the Quonset 56, a taller warehouse-style version capable of storing jeeps or artillery. The modular design allowed huts to be connected end-to-end like train cars, forming sprawling complexes under one continuous curve. At night, when the camp lights dimmed, the silhouettes of those domes shimmered under moonlight, hundreds of steel ribs stretching into darkness. They looked like the backbone of an empire being assembled piece by piece. In New Guinea, Private First Class George Tully remembered how his squad built their hut in the rain. "We didn't even know what it was supposed to be," he said years later. "Just a pile of metal." But the instructions were so simple. A few bolts, a wrench, and you had a roof over your head. The first night we slept in there, The rain came down like hell, but we were dry. That little tin shack felt like a palace. The Quonset Hut was also a silent witness to strategy and tragedy. In the Philippines, one served as General Douglas MacArthur's temporary headquarters when he returned in 1944. In another, near the beaches of Normandy, a group of officers planned the logistics for Operation Cobra, the breakout that would liberate France. Sometimes, though, they became places of grief. After heavy battles, Quonset huts were converted into makeshift morgues. Medics placed wooden tags on the boots of fallen soldiers, the echo of footsteps muted by the steel floor. These huts, which had sheltered the living, now guarded the dead with quiet dignity. Back in the United States, civilians began to see photographs of these strange curved huts appearing everywhere the troops went. Magazines like Life and Popular Mechanics featured them as icons of modern engineering. A sense of awe spread. Here was architecture that was democratic, transportable, and indestructible. By late 1944, Quonset huts dotted every front line. In the Pacific, they stretched across Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa like silver beads on the landscape. Pilots returning from missions could spot them glinting in the sun, the curved roofs catching the light like waves frozen in steel. Inside one such hut on Okinawa, a young Marine corporal named Thomas Vega kept a diary. He wrote about the storms that shook the roof like thunder drums, about the smell of diesel and wet canvas, about how at night, when the bombing paused, he could hear the rain sliding down the metal like whispers. "We live in a circle of tin," he wrote, "but somehow it feels like the safest place on Earth." As the war neared its climax, Quonset huts became the invisible infrastructure of victory. They stored the spare parts that kept planes flying, the rations that kept soldiers fed, and the fuel that powered tanks across Europe. The engineers who designed them at Camp Endicott had dreamed of a universal shelter, and now their creation had become exactly that. When the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima and the world shifted into a new and uncertain age, the Quonset hut remained unchanged, a simple, curved constant amid chaos. As 1945 approached, the war's end was in sight. Yet the story of the Quonset hut was far from over. The same structure that had sheltered men in war would soon become the foundation of peace. Across continents, from ruined cities to university campuses, a quiet transformation was about to begin. The humble tin hut, born from necessity, was about to rebuild the world it helped destroy. August 1945, the war was over. The guns had gone silent, and across every ocean men were finally coming home. Yet the world they returned to was not the same one they had left. Cities were shattered, industries were drained, and millions were displaced. The military had one pressing problem: an ocean of surplus material. Among the mountains of leftover gear, one thing appeared everywhere: the curved steel shells of the Quonset hut. There were over 150,000 Quonset huts scattered across the globe. Some were in the Pacific, rusting under the tropical sun. Others sat on the English countryside, empty and echoing. The U.S. Navy alone had ordered so many that entire ports were still filled with unopened crates. Each one contained the promise of shelter, a promise the world desperately needed. In bombed-out Europe, the Quonset hut quickly found a second life. The U.S. military began donating them to reconstruction efforts. In France, Italy, and the Netherlands, homeless families turned them into houses. With wood floors, curtains, and stoves added inside, these huts became warm homes amid the rubble. Children played outside their arched doors, while their parents rebuilt what the war had taken. In England, where the airfields once buzzed with American bombers, the leftover huts became homes for veterans. Entire Quonset villages appeared overnight, rows of curved steel houses with little gardens and makeshift chimneys. Journalists dubbed them tin towns, but for thousands of families they were a fresh start. The design that had conquered war was now conquering peace. Back in the United States, the same story unfolded. The GI Bill had given returning soldiers the opportunity to go to college, but universities had no space for the flood of new students. So they turned to the one structure that could be built quickly, cheaply, and in massive numbers. Quonset huts became dormitories, classrooms, and dining halls at campuses across America. At the University of Minnesota, students joked that they were living in Quonset Village. At Harvard, they studied philosophy under the same curved roofs that had once sheltered soldiers. At Stanford, entire departments were housed in rows of silver huts. They were hot in summer, cold in winter, but they were home. One student veteran at Brown University wrote, "It's funny. We used to live in these things overseas, and now we're back in them, only this time we're studying for exams instead of fighting a war." The Quonset Hut's flexibility made it an architect's dream. It could be adapted into almost anything: churches, shops, post offices, or schools. Its simplicity invited creativity. People painted them in bright colors, added porches and windows, even second floors. In small American towns, Quonsets became diners and hardware stores. In Alaska, they served as weather stations. In Hawaii, as surf shops. The humble steel ark had found its way into nearly every corner of the modern world. But its role in history wasn't just practical. It was emotional. For millions of veterans, the curved silhouette of the Quonset Hut carried memories. It reminded them of nights spent listening to rain on the roof, of laughter echoing through steel, of survival. It was the shape of endurance. In 1946, Life magazine ran a feature titled "The House That Follows the Soldier Home." It showed photographs of families moving into Quonset huts on military bases, converted into housing projects. Children climbed the curved walls. Mothers planted flowers out front. The caption read, "The war's most useful invention finds a new mission, peace." Soon the Quonset Hut became a pop culture icon. It appeared in films, advertisements, and even comic books. Companies began selling modified versions to civilians. Kits could be ordered through catalogs. Build your own Quonset home for $200. For people facing housing shortages, it was a miracle. Even abroad, its legacy grew. In Japan, after the atomic bombings, U.S. occupation forces used Quonset huts as offices, barracks, and hospitals. In Korea, they housed soldiers during the Korean War. In the Middle East and Africa, they became the backbone of military and humanitarian operations. Wherever conflict or crisis emerged, the Quonset followed. Architects and historians later called it the architecture of necessity. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but it was honest, pure function shaped into form. Buckminster Fuller, the famous futurist architect, admired it as an early example of sustainable modular design. He said, "The Quonset Hut is proof that efficiency can have its own beauty." By the 1950s, Quonset huts were being used in ways their original designers could never have imagined. One was converted into a movie theater in Montana. Another became a roller skating rink in Kansas. In Florida, a group of artists turned a cluster of Quonsets into an art colony. In California, they became workshops for the early aerospace industry. The same shape that had sheltered soldiers now sheltered dreamers. But the Quonset story wasn't without its struggles. Over time, their thin steel shells rusted, insulation wore away, and the world began to move on. Suburban homes replaced temporary housing, and newer materials replaced corrugated iron. By the 1960s, many Quonset huts were being demolished or abandoned. Yet, something remarkable happened. People refused to let them die. Across the United States, artists, veterans, and preservationists began restoring old Quonsets. They saw them not as relics, but as living symbols of a generation's resilience. In Rhode Island, the birthplace of the first Quonset hut, a museum preserved one of the originals, complete with its blueprints and wartime photographs. Visitors could walk inside and feel the echo of history in every curved beam. Today, you can still find them, standing quietly in forgotten airfields, behind barns, along rural highways. Some have been transformed into coffee shops or yoga studios. Others remain exactly as they were, weathered by time but unbroken. Architectural students study the Quonset hut as a case of perfect simplicity, form meeting function in its purest sense. A structure that could be mass-produced, transported, and assembled anywhere in the world with minimal effort, yet strong enough to withstand storms, war, and decades of use. More than 80 years after its invention, the Quonset hut still inspires new generations. Modern designers have reimagined it using sustainable materials, recycled steel, solar panels, and insulated panels. They call them eco-Quonsets, futuristic homes that echo the past. From the ashes of World War II to the dawn of the 21st century, the Quonset hut has endured, flexible, resilient, and timeless. It has outlived the empires and generals that built it. In one of his last interviews, Peter de Jong, The engineer who helped design the original prototype at Camp Endicott was asked what he thought about his creation's legacy. He smiled and said, "We weren't trying to make history. We were just trying to give people shelter. Maybe that's the best kind of history to make." He was right. The Quonset Hut story isn't about war or victory. It's about humanity's ability to adapt, rebuild, and endure. From the jungles of Guadalcanal to the streets of post-war London, from the frozen airfields of Alaska to the sunny campuses of California, it stood as a silent witness to everything mankind could survive and everything it could hope for. The curve of its roof is more than just steel. It's a symbol of shelter in chaos, of comfort in uncertainty, of peace after destruction. And even today, when the wind blows through an old airfield or across a forgotten base, you can sometimes hear it, the faint metallic hum of history, echoing beneath the arch of a Quonset hut.